Today, Vietnam stands as one of the most unique and fastest rising countries on the planet. A place of explosive megacities, rapidly developing beach towns, and an economy powering forward with unbelievable speed. But it wasn't always like this. Not long ago, Vietnam was a nation crushed by famine, torn apart by decades of war, invaded again and again, and pushed to the edge of erasure. So how did a land once defined by suffering transform into one of Asia's fastest growing economies, a rising hub of innovation, trade, and youthful ambition? How did it rebuild itself from near destruction and rise again, faster than many ever expected? Let's find out. Long before the wars, the reforms, and the cafe-filled streets buzzing with scooters, it began with a legend. According to Vietnamese tradition, the story starts thousands of years ago with Lac Long Quan, a dragon lord of the sea, and Ao Co, a mountain fairy. Their union produced 100 sons, considered the ancestors of the Vietnamese people. 50 followed their mother to the mountains, 50 followed their father to the coast. It's a poetic way to explain a nation shaped by rivers, jungles, and the sea, a symbolic origin for a people who would spend millennia defending that fragile unity. These early communities eventually united under the Hung Kings, the legendary rulers of Van Lang, Vietnam's first proto-state. This is where the foundation of Vietnamese culture took root. Wet rice farming, tight-knit village life, bronze drums, and the iconic Nan La, the conical hat that has existed for nearly 3,000 years. But Vietnam's ancient world soon collided with one of history's most powerful empires. In 111 BCE, the Han Empire conquered northern Vietnam, beginning nearly 1,000 years of Chinese domination. Chinese script, Confucian bureaucracy, new farming techniques, metallurgy, and statecraft flowed into the region. Yet despite the immense influence, Vietnamese identity did not disappear. If anything, foreign rule sharpened it. Resistance movements rose again and again, some dramatic and unforgettable, like the Trung sisters leading armies on war elephants. Others quieter, rooted in villages determined to preserve their customs. After a millennium of occupation, the long struggle for independence finally succeeded in 938 CE, when Ngo Quyen defeated Chinese forces at the Battle of Bac Dang River. Using wooden stakes hidden beneath the tides, he trapped and destroyed the invading fleet, a brilliant victory that restored independence and marked the birth of Dai Viet, a confident new state. Over the following centuries, powerful dynasties shaped the kingdom. The Le and Tran courts built organized government systems, expanded infrastructure, promoted Confucian education, and fostered a sophisticated culture. They also faced and defeated the Mongol Empire 3 separate times, an extraordinary feat that few nations in history can claim. These victories cemented a lasting sense of pride and secured Dai Viet's place as one of East Asia's most resilient states. By the 15th century, the later Le dynasty ushered in what many historians consider Vietnam's golden age, marked by advancements in law, literature, and territorial expansion. But unity did not last. Beginning in the 1600s, the country split between two powerful families, the Trinh in the north and the Nguyen in the south. Despite this division, Vietnam continued pushing its frontiers, especially under the Nguyen lords, who expanded deep into the Mekong Delta and absorbed lands that helped shape the nation's modern borders. During these centuries, an unusual trend took shape: the rise of the surname Nguyen. From the 1500s to the 1800s, many families adopted the name to align with or seek protection from the increasingly powerful Nguyen rulers. When Nguyen An, later Emperor Gia Long, unified the country in 1802, the trend accelerated. Taking the surname became a strategy to gain favor, avoid punishment, or simply survive political change. This is why today nearly 40% of Vietnamese people share the same last name, a centuries-long survival tactic rather than coincidence. In 1802, Gia Long established the Nguyen dynasty, Vietnam's final imperial era. At its height, it governed a unified territory remarkably close to the nation's modern borders. For the moment, Vietnam stood as a sovereign monarchy, shaped by myth, forged through resistance, and unaware that it was about to collide with the rising forces of global empire in the century ahead. When the Nguyen dynasty entered the 19th century, Vietnam was united, confident, and deeply rooted in its traditions. But far beyond its shores, the world was shifting fast, and France had already set its ambitions on Southeast Asia. In 1858, French warships attacked Da Nang, launching a conquest that would reshape Vietnam for nearly a century. By the early 1900s, the country had been folded into French Indochina alongside Laos and Cambodia. Colonial rule transformed Vietnam in dramatic and often painful ways. Massive plantations spread across the countryside, rice in the Mekong Delta, rubber in the southern highlands, and millions were pushed into harsh, sometimes forced labor. New cities, railways, and ports emerged, but not to enrich the Vietnamese. They existed to serve the growing appetite of the French Empire. Catholic missions expanded, French culture seeped into education and architecture, and a new urban class slowly began to take shape. But beneath it all, resentment brewed, in rural villages, in crowded factories, and among young Vietnamese who studied abroad and returned home questioning everything. It was in this simmering atmosphere that a young man named Nguyen Sinh Cung, later known as Ho Chi Minh, left Vietnam searching for answers. Throughout the 1910s and 1920s, Ho Chi Minh traveled the world, working odd jobs as a baker, painter, and kitchen helper, all while studying the machinery of colonialism and revolution. By the 1930s, he had become one of the strongest voices calling for Vietnamese independence. For Ho Chi Minh, communism wasn't something to worship, it was a strategy, a tool to unite peasants, workers, and nationalists toward one shared purpose: ending foreign rule. He helped form the Viet Minh, a broad nationalist coalition that soon stood at the core of resistance. And then, as if the struggle weren't already immense, another power arrived. During World War II, Japan occupied Vietnam and pushed the French aside. Their wartime policies, including rice confiscation and disruptions to farming, triggered one of the deadliest tragedies in Vietnamese history. In 1945, up to 1 million people starved to death. The famine destroyed whatever legitimacy colonial rule had left. So when Japan surrendered in August 1945, Vietnam was suddenly left in a power vacuum. The Viet Minh seized the moment. Ho Chi Minh declared independence in Hanoi, even quoting the U.S. Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. But independence would not come easily. France wanted its colony back. The result was the First Indochina War, beginning in 1946, a brutal struggle between French forces and the Viet Minh. Jungle by jungle, village by village, the Viet Minh fought a wealthier, better-armed opponent and slowly ground them down. By 1954, the war reached its dramatic climax at Dien Bien Phu, a remote valley where the French hoped to force a decisive battle. Instead, the Viet Minh achieved the unthinkable, hauling heavy artillery up the surrounding mountains, piece by piece, sometimes on bicycles, sometimes with their bare hands. For 56 relentless days, they pounded the French garrison. On May 7, 1954, the fortress fell. For France, it marked the end of an empire. For Vietnam, it was only the beginning of a deeper divide. After the Geneva Accords, Vietnam was split at the 17th parallel. In the north stood Ho Chi Minh, and a socialist state backed by the Soviet Union and China. In the south emerged the Republic of Vietnam, backed by the United States and determined to stop communism from spreading in Southeast Asia. What was supposed to be a temporary division soon hardened into a civil war. The conflict that followed, from 1955 to 1975, became one of the defining wars of the 20th century, a collision of ideology, nationalism, and foreign power. In the south, the Viet Cong, backed by the North, fought through dense jungles and rural villages. The United States sent hundreds of thousands of troops, unleashing overwhelming firepower, helicopters, napalm, Agent Orange, into a war where conventional military strength meant surprisingly little. Meanwhile, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a sprawling network of supply routes running through Laos and Cambodia, kept the insurgency alive despite constant bombings. In 1968, the Tet Offensive shocked the world, proving the war was nowhere near over. Protests erupted across America, and the conflict became a global symbol of resistance, rebellion, and geopolitical failure. But inside Vietnam, it was simply catastrophic. Millions of lives lost, cities reduced to rubble, families torn apart. In April 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon. The South surrendered. The long war the longest struggle in modern Vietnamese history was finally over. Vietnam was reunified, but the country lay in ruins, and yet, from that devastation, a new Vietnam would slowly begin to rise. When the guns finally fell silent in 1975, Vietnam stood victorious, but utterly shattered. Cities lay in ruins, farmland was cratered and poisoned, and millions of families were grieving. Winning the war had been brutal. Rebuilding the nation would be even harder. The first years of reunification were far from the peaceful dream many expected. The U.S. embargo isolated Vietnam from global trade, and collectivized farming struggled to feed the population. Urban families survived on ration coupons. Rural villages faced chronic shortages. Former officials were sent to re-education camps, and as the economy collapsed, hundreds of thousands fled by boat, one of the era's defining tragedies. By the early 1980s, inflation was spiraling, food was scarce, and Vietnam, after centuries of resisting foreign powers, was staring down the threat of famine. Then, in 1986, came a turning point that nobody saw coming. At the Sixth Party Congress, the government launched Đổi Mới, renovation. It was a radical pivot from rigid central planning toward a hybrid system that mixed socialist ideals with capitalist incentives. Farmers could sell their crops, private business became legal, foreign investment was welcomed, markets opened, entrepreneurship, once forbidden, became a lifeline. Overnight, small family shops filled the streets, farms began producing again, and foreign companies from Japan, Korea, and Europe started viewing Vietnam not as a battlefield, but as a future competitor. The 1990s and early 2000s saw the rise of Vietnam's first major corporations. Telecom companies connected remote mountain villages to urban centers. Banks expanded, often tied to powerful families or ministries. State-owned enterprises grew into massive conglomerates dominating steel, energy, construction, and transport. It was the birth of Vietnam's red capitalists, entrepreneurs operating inside a socialist system but playing by unapologetically capitalist rules. But rapid growth brought corruption. Connections, quan hy, became as valuable as money. An envelope culture appeared. State-linked corporations and real estate empires became magnets for scandal. Yet unlike many countries in the region, Vietnam confronted corruption head-on. CEOs, generals, and even ministers were arrested in sweeping anti-corruption campaigns. The system continued pulling between discipline and excess, reform and temptation. By 2010, Vietnam had transformed. To the world, it was no longer a war-torn nation, but an ambitious, rising economy. A country where tradition met opportunity, where hardship produced resilience, and where Đổi Mới didn't just revive Vietnam, it gave it a second life. Since 2010, Vietnam's economy has taken off like a controlled rocket launch. From Hanoi to Ho Chi Minh City, entire industrial zones have risen from the ground, turning the country into Asia's fastest-growing manufacturing hub. As global companies look for alternatives to China, Vietnam has become one of the world's top destinations. Samsung built its largest overseas base here. Nike, Adidas, Intel, and countless Apple suppliers shifted production into Vietnamese factories. And unlike many developing nations, Vietnam isn't getting rich by exporting resources. It's creating wealth through manufacturing, technology, and a young workforce that learns fast and adapts even faster. On the streets, Vietnam's transformation is impossible to ignore. The country has leaped straight into an electric future. VinFast, a company born less than 15 years ago, is now Vietnam's first global EV brand, with its cars dominating local roads and expanding abroad. Electric scooters from Dat Bike glide through traffic, reshaping daily life in a nation where motorcycles still outnumber cars 7-1. Supported by government incentives and embraced by younger generations, the EV boom reflects something deeper. Vietnam doesn't just adopt global trends, it builds its own. As technology reshapes the roads, infrastructure is transforming the landscape. New airports are underway. Metro systems in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, once considered fantasy, are finally becoming reality. Highways carve through mountains that once took days to cross, Entire smart city districts are being designed with AI-managed traffic, green corridors, and futuristic architecture. Vietnam isn't trying to catch up anymore, it's building ahead. Ask any traveler or digital nomad why they choose Vietnam, and the answer is simple. Everything just clicks. It's cleaner, safer, cheaper, and more exhilarating than much of Southeast Asia. The food is world-class, long-term visas are accessible, apartments are modern, and the coastline feels endless. Da Nang has quietly become the new expat-friendly hub. Hanoi holds the cultural heartbeat, and Ho Chi Minh City races ahead as the loud, fast, addictive economic engine. Many arrive planning to stay a month, and somehow wake up 5 years later still here. Since 2020, tourism has surged back with cleaner cities, upgraded airports, modern hotels, and one of the most exciting food scenes in the region. And as Thailand and Bali grow crowded and expensive, Vietnam is becoming the smarter choice for digital nomads and travelers seeking ultra-fast internet, walkable cities, green parks, and locals genuinely eager to practice English and make foreign friends. Yet Vietnam's greatest strength isn't in skyscrapers or factories. It's in its people. Vietnam's Gen Z is globally connected, English-speaking, entrepreneurial, and fearless. They build apps, run cafes, start fashion labels, launch tech startups, and study abroad. Their parents survived war. They grew up with opportunity, and they may be the generation that fully propels Vietnam into global leadership. And then there's coffee, practically a national religion. Vietnam embraced Robusta like nowhere else on Earth, becoming one of the world's top exporters. Coffee culture spills into every corner of life. Plastic stools on sidewalks, old men debating chess, students studying after school, entrepreneurs sealing deals over iced condensed milk coffee. And the cuisine is just as iconic: pho, banh mi, bún cha, com tam, a culinary legacy shaped by indigenous roots, Chinese influence, French colonialism, and Southeast Asian creativity. Politically, Vietnam remains a one-party socialist republic, but daily life is nothing like Cold War stereotypes. Most people don't discuss politics openly. They focus on business, family, travel, and opportunity. Criticism exists, especially online, but usually within unwritten boundaries everyone understands. In foreign policy, Vietnam practices bamboo diplomacy, flexible enough to bend, strong enough not to break. Positioned between China and the United States, it cooperates with both, aligns fully with neither, and uses its neutrality to expand trade and strengthen security. Within the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, Vietnam has become one of the region's most stable and influential voices. Challenges, of course, remain. Corruption scandals involving land deals, real estate collapses, and troubled banks test public trust. Pollution, from smoggy Hanoi mornings to polluted rivers, is a growing threat. Traffic can feel like beautifully choreographed chaos. Inequality is rising, with luxury towers overlooking crowded working-class streets. Yet Vietnam confronts these issues more aggressively than many expect. Anti-corruption campaigns topple high-ranking officials and billionaire executives, reshaping political power and signaling that reform is not optional. It's existential. Today's Vietnam is a story of momentum, a nation rising from hardship to become a modern Asian power. Innovative, ambitious, confident, and full of fascinating contradictions. This is no longer the Vietnam of history books. This is a Vietnam building the 21st century in real time, and its next chapter has only just begun.